Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's Sprintax tax webinar for University of Pennsylvania international students, scholars, and non-residents. My name is Ryan Ludden. I'm from the Sprintax team. And as the title of this slide suggests, hopefully today we're going to give you everything you need to know about non-resident tax for this filing season. Now, before I start the session, I do have something in common with all of you, most likely in the audience, in that, I once was an international student in the US as well. I know how stressful a topic this can be, especially for all of you first-time filers. But hopefully by the end of today's session, you'll have more of a greater understanding of what you need to do for this filing season, and you'll be a little less stressed and a bit more comfortable about tax filing obligations. Now, before we start, just some general notes. You will notice that this session is muted, just so we've got a good recording to share with you all. A recording will be made available to everyone who's registered and attended within the next 24 hours from this software, and we'll also share a recording with the international office. You will see a questions box, however, so we will do some time at the end for Q&A. If you have questions, what I usually always say is most of the time I cover some of those questions that are in your mind as we go through the webinar. But as we get towards the end, if we still haven't covered some of those topics that you're looking for an answer on, feel free to pop those in the questions box and we'll look at common themes that are coming through at the end of the session. Then with all things taxes, you will always see a disclaimer. I always say tax is a little bit like your own DNA. It might seem like we're both the same on paper. We could be from the same hometown, studying the same program at UPenn, but for one small detail, we could be treated differently for tax purposes. So keep in mind that today is there to give you helpful information on taxes for non-residents, and it's not to be construed as tax advice. Alrighty, so what are we going to jump into today? Well, we're going to go through a general overview of tax for non-resident students and scholars. A lot of different topics within that umbrella. So we'll cover those topics first. We will move towards understanding the implications of misfiling or forgetting to file for previous years and how you can, catch up if you haven't filed for previous years, or how to correct an incorrect return. I'll then outline how you can use Sprintax software to help prepare your end of year tax return. So I'll give a little bit more details on how you can use the Sprintax software to help prepare your end of year federal and or state returns. And then we'll do Q&A towards the end. So where to start? I always usually start with the important date for the tax season. And whilst we're sitting here in 2024, we are actually looking back. We're looking at everything that's happened between January 1st, 2023 through to December 31st, 2023 for this tax filing season. So basically all of the time that you spent on US soil during 2023 and the US source income that you spent or you received in 2023 is what the IRS are generally concerned about for this filing season. And when you're filing a federal tax return, the easiest way I find to describe it is it's like balancing the books with the IRS, the US tax authorities. You're making sure that you haven't overpaid or underpaid taxes on the income you received during the year. And the deadline to file your tax return is Monday, April 15th, 2024. So the next concept is residency for tax purposes. And this generally confuses a lot of international students and scholars. I can certainly see the reasons why. It is quite a confusing topic. Now, while Sprintax will make this a little bit easier for you, we've tried to break down some of the main things to know about residency for tax purposes. And generally, from the IRS perspective, the US federal tax authorities, most international students and scholars who are on their F, J, M, or Q visas are considered as a non-resident for tax purposes for a set period of time. You might also hear the concept exempt individual. This basically means they're exempt from counting their days towards what's called a substantial presence test. I'll explain that in a little minute or two. If you are an international student on a J1 or F1 student visa, you're automatically considered a non-resident for tax purposes for the first 5 calendar years in the US. Now, it's important to note that even if you stayed in the US for a single day of one of those calendar years, the IRS will count that towards one of your tax years. So if Ryan landed at UPenn on December 31st for January classes, the IRS will treat that one day in December as one of Ryan's tax years of presence. So do keep that in mind. Scholars, researchers, interns, professors, and their dependents on J visas, you're given 2 tax years of non-resident status, where again, you're also considered an exempt individual. You're basically exempt from counting your days towards this substantial presence test. Now, after the 5-year period for an international student, a J1 or F1 student visa holder, or after the 2-year period as a scholar or researcher, your days then generally start counting towards this substantial presence test. It's a 183-day rule. If you are present across your non-exempt period in the US for more than 183 days, you'll generally then be deemed a resident for tax purposes. So if you're present in your 6th year as an F1 student for more than 183 days, you'll generally then be deemed a resident for tax. Same goes with your 3rd year as a scholar or researcher. So what I would say here is, if you're still confused on tax residency, the Sprintax return software does quite a good job in confirming whether or not you are a resident or non-resident for tax, and I'll explain that a little bit later. Now, I do want to learn a little bit more about all of you today, so I do have a couple of polls launched in the system just to get your own understanding. And don't worry if you don't know the answers here. Before we jump into this topic, what's your own opinion in terms of who needs to file tax documents to the IRS as a non-resident? Do you think all non-residents need to file something regardless of income? Do you think only those who earned US income need to file? Maybe non-residents don't have to file tax documents, or maybe you're unsure, and that's absolutely fine as well. Great, we've seen very high response rates here. Alrighty, looks like we have got a winner, and that is 80% were correct. If you were present in the US for any part of 2023 as a non-resident, you would need to file at least Form 8843. So everyone needs to file something regardless of whether or not you earned US source income. So here's kind of some of those golden questions, the answer to some of your golden questions. What do I need to do, Ryan, for this tax filing season? Who must file for 2023? Simply put, if you're a non-resident, exempt individual, if you're present at any point in 2023, you would need to complete Form 8843 at a minimum. I'll explain what that form is in the next slide. Then the rule is simple in terms of who needs to file a federal tax return, which is called the 1040 NR. Essentially, if you earn any US taxable income over $0, you'll need to file a federal tax return by law. And that is in addition to your 8843. So everyone needs to file 8843 at a minimum if you're present in 2023 as a non-resident for tax purposes. And then you'll need to file a federal tax return, the 1040 NR, if you also earned US taxable income. Okay, so 8843, statement for exempt individuals and individuals with a medical condition. What on earth does that mean, Ryan? I know it's a confusing title, but if you remember back to the residency slide, when I talked about a non-resident for tax purposes being an exempt individual, this is basically a declaration of non-resident status to the IRS, where you're basically saying, hey, my name is Ryan, I'm an F1 student from France, I'm still an exempt individual, please don't count my days of presence in the US for these years towards that substantial presence test, as I'm still maybe within my 5 years of non-resident status. So it's a simple tax form. Sprintax returns will help to populate this form for you. And also be aware that if you just need to file this form alone, you don't need a social security number or an ITIN to just file Form 8843. But it is the minimum requirement for anyone who was present as a non-resident for tax purposes in 2023. So many of you, I'm sure, have been receiving taxable income during the year. And as I mentioned, if you earn any taxable US income over $0, you will need to file a federal tax return as a non-resident. So I suppose when we think of taxable US income, many of us think of, the first thing that comes to mind obviously is employment, right? If you're working on campus or on OPT, CPT, you might be receiving employment income, and that absolutely is likely going to be taxable and is going to trigger a federal filing obligation. But there are other types of income that you might earn that are still taxable and reportable. The second good example is if you received a taxable scholarship that covered costs other than tuition or tuition-related expenses. So your tuition is usually non-taxable, non-reportable. But if you received benefits like room and board, stipends, even prizes or awards for doing some great work on campus, these would generally be taxable and would be reported on an income document. And I'll explain that in the next slide as well when we talk about how these income types are actually reported. You might also have had gains in investment. Maybe you had other income like doing well on the roulette table in Vegas at the weekend. Maybe you participated in focus groups and received compensation for your participation there. Maybe you rented your Airbnb in Philadelphia for more than 14 nights. Or we also see a lot of, we work with other art institutions where folks might sell their art after semester ends. Again, these are a little bit less common, but they're all different types of income that might trigger a reporting obligation. Importantly, there are some types of income that might come to your mind that don't trigger a filing requirement for non-residents. As I mentioned, the first one was scholarship for tuition and tuition-related expenses. This is generally non-taxable and non-reportable. A scholarship received from outside of the US. So if your home country university paid for you to study at UPenn, maybe you might be able to tell my accent is from Ireland. If Trinity College Dublin wanted to pay for me to study at UPenn for a year or a semester or whatnot, that would be great. But generally, that would be seen as foreign source income. So it's not going to trigger a federal filing obligation in the US. It's also not uncommon for your parents or relatives to transfer money from overseas to you to help with the cost of living in the United States. That again will be seen as non-US source income. The IRS will not look at that as being taxable or triggering a filing requirement. Similarly, income earned in your home country. If you had a job before you arrived at UPenn in your home country, or maybe you had rental income or investment income back in your home country, as long as you're a non-resident for tax purposes, the IRS will not consider this as reportable in the US. They will only look at your US source income. Now, that would change if you were deemed a resident for tax purposes, then your worldwide income would be subject to reporting. But as a non-resident, the IRS are only concerned about your US source income. Finally, interest on a regular savings account. I always say it probably won't even buy you a cup of coffee, but generally up until a certain amount, that won't carry taxable implications. If it did, your bank would usually issue you with a 1099 form if there was taxable implications on any of those. Very, very important slide here, income documents. If you have received taxable and reportable income during 2023, it's very likely that it's going to be reported on one or multiple of these income documents, and you will need them on Sprintax returns. You will need them for purposes of filing your tax returns if you receive this type of income. The first is a W-2. It's the most common. This would generally reflect all of the wages, salary that you earned during the tax year from your employment and the taxes that were withheld on it. So if you were working on campus during the year or on your OPT or CPT, you might receive a W-2 that reflects the wages and and the total wages that you earned during 2023 and the tax that was withheld on those wages. So it's really important, if you did receive a W-2, that you use that on your tax return. We'll outline where you can access your W-2 a little bit later from you, Penn. 1042-S form. Basically, this might cover the most two popular types of income here. Is it would report any taxable scholarship that you received from the university or other universities if you were also, if you transferred from other ones. It can also cover income that was exempt due to a tax treaty. So if you had employment income at the university and you applied a treaty benefit, which maybe helped to exempt a portion of your wages from tax withholding, that portion would generally be reported on a 1042-S form. Prizes or awards can also show up on a 1042-S, and the Penn 1042-S forms are now available in your Sprintax calculus account under the tax forms page in the 2023 tax year. I'll explain a little bit more about that later on in this session. Finally, the 1099 series, they are less common, but you might get them. You could get, 1099 INTs, NECs, 1099Gs. They cover lots of different types of income, from rental income, investment income, independent contractor services, and more. If you have received one of those 1099 forms, you can outline that on Sprintax, as it is an income document that needs to be reported. A note on non-resident spouses and dependents. I suppose if you're here with your spouse and you both are non-residents for tax purposes, unfortunately, you would be treated as two separate individuals and you cannot file jointly on your US tax return. So the IRS will treat you as two separate individuals. You'll both need to file your own Form 8843 if you were present during 2023 as a non-resident. And if you both earned US source income, you'd both file your own separate 1040-NR forms. You'll send them separately to the IRS because you cannot file jointly on a US tax return as two non-residents. The only way you could file jointly as a the only way you could file jointly on a US tax return is if you were married to a resident for tax purposes. In that case, you can decide to file jointly on the resident return, or you can decide to file separately as a non-resident for tax. What I'd say there is, do the math to see what option is actually most beneficial for your own circumstances. Now, for those of you who might have children and dependents, what I'd say is you can, when you're going through Sprintax, you can add a dependent form 8843 for any of your dependents that might be present in the US, but you would send those to the IRS separately as well. So FICA taxes, if you're looking at your W-2 and maybe you notice that there's Social Security or Medicare taxes withheld, that's what we're kind of speaking about with regards to FICA tax. It's a tax that's supposed to help you with the cost of healthcare later on in life, but in the eyes of the IRS, I guess, international students and scholars generally won't see the benefit of paying into that tax. So for the most part, non-resident international students and scholars on J1 and F1 visas are exempt from paying FICA taxes. Now, it's not a blanket rule. H1B, J2, and TN visa holders are subject to FICA taxes from their first day of employment. And if you change to being a resident for tax purposes, you could have FICA taxes withheld there as well. This often might be more so the case of having FICA taxes withheld in error by outside employers from the university. So you might have, I often see maybe catering companies or other companies that might not know the differences between non-resident tax and the resident tax side of things. They might potentially withhold FICA taxes in error. If they have, you can you can ask the employer to see if they can issue a FICA refund back. If the employer refuses, you can prepare a FICA tax claim on Sprintax, and that is called Form 843 and 8316. However, that can take a long time to get back, so approaching the employer first is the best thing to do there And you can see just an impact of FICA taxes being withheld in error there. We've got students on different wage levels, and the very bottom shows the student portion that could be withheld in error if that was to happen. So, we'd rather you get that back in your pockets than not having it if it's a case you've had FICA taxes withheld in error. On the state tax side, there are over 43 states that have state income tax laws across the US. Pennsylvania is one of those states that has state income tax rules. They also have their own residency rules. So as I mentioned on the federal side, we talked about tax residency. There's also residency rules on the Pennsylvania state side. Generally, you're going to be considered a non-resident for tax purposes if you're not domiciled in Pennsylvania and you didn't maintain a permanent place of abode. So, it is likely that lots of international students are here temporarily, don't have a permanent place of abode or are domiciled. It may be the case that you're deemed a non-resident for state tax purposes. But what Sprintax returns software will do is it will look at your time spent in the state. It will ask you additional questions for Pennsylvania state taxes, and it will help to confirm not only your residency for PA state, but it will also help to figure out, do you actually need to file a Pennsylvania state return? And generally, in terms of who needs to file, if you're a resident, non-resident, or part-year resident, you'll need to file a Pennsylvania tax return if you received gross taxable income in excess of $33 during 2023, even if no tax is due with your return, and or you incurred a loss from any transaction as an individual, sole proprietor, partner in a partnership, or a Pennsylvania S corporation shareholder. Again, I wouldn't worry too much as you're going through the Sprintax return software. We'll look at the source of your income. We'll look at where you resided during the year. We'll be able to confirm not only if you've got a Pennsylvania state filing obligation, but also if you need to file other state tax returns. Additionally, Philadelphia city wage tax is deducted from your wages. Generally, there is no tax return filing requirement for the city of Philadelphia if no additional city wage tax is due. So, fun topic here, the ITIN. What I'd say here is if you've got a social security number, you don't need to worry about this slide. Additionally, if you just need to file Form 8843 and didn't receive any US income during 23, you also don't need to worry about this slide. The ITIN is generally required when you need to file a federal tax return, but you're not eligible for a social security number. It can be most common as a result with international athletes or scholarship recipients. There are two options you can take with the ITIN. You can file in advance of filing a federal return. If you're filing in advance of your federal return, you can complete and sign what's called Form W7, which is the ITIN application form. Then you may be able to get a responsible officer at the school to sign a certification letter, which certifies copies of your passport, visa, and your I-20 or DS 2019 if you're an F or J visa holder. You'll then mail that W7 and the certified copies and the certification letter to the IRS to the address outlined here. And depending on how busy the IRS are, you might hear back in around, I would usually say a minimum of kind of 6-8 weeks, but it can be a lot longer, particularly in high season. If it's time to file your taxes and you don't have a tax number and you need to file a tax return, you can decide to apply for an ITIN alongside your federal tax return. Now, important here is that the rules change when you're filing an ITIN alongside your federal return. And what you need to do there is you'll need to again complete and sign a Form W7. You'll need to attach your 1040NR form, your federal return. And importantly, you need to get a certified copy of your passport. That can only be certified by either a certified acceptance agent or an IRS official. Your home country issuing passport office can help if you're back home now, or US embassy or consulate could help if you're back in your home country. Again, what I'd say here is Sprintax Returns does have a facility to generate the W7 form if you're filing it alongside your federal return, but you just need to remember that you need to certify your copy of your passport. 1098T. This is quite a common question. If you've got a 1098-T, this is a tuition statement. It's generally used by residents for tax purposes to claim an educational tax credit. Now, unfortunately, non-residents cannot use this credit. They're not eligible to claim it. And Sprintax returns will not ask you for a 1098-T if you're a non-resident. The problem there is many individuals might file as a resident for tax purposes by mistake using resident softwares like TurboTax. They might claim this educational credit in error, and when they realize they've made a mistake and have to correct that error, they end up having to pay sums of money back to the IRS. So if you receive a 1098-T and you're a non-resident for tax, keep it in a safe place, but you won't need it on Sprintax returns as you cannot claim this educational tax credit. If some of you have already filed your taxes or you're about to file your return, maybe you're due a refund. If you're wondering, how long does it take to get my refund back? That can really depend. It can take anywhere from 6 weeks up to 6 months in the small print before the IRS themselves will start adding interest on the refund that they owe back to you if it surpasses 6 months. Now, there is a facility that you can check the status of your tax return. And there's been some updates on that for this year. It's called Where's My Refund? The link to that page is here. And on a side note, on your control panel, you'll see the slides for today's session. So you can download the slides and follow the links here. But this will give you a status of your tax return once you've sent it to the IRS. Timelines on a state level will be similar, but of course, it's going to vary from state to state. On the cryptocurrency side, we often see some questions around this. Generally, non-residents would need to report cryptocurrency if you did any of the following. If you converted crypto to a regular currency, like US dollars, if you used it to pay for goods or services, if you sold cryptocurrency, or if you received free coins through a fork or an airdrop. Holding crypto may not actually require reporting obligations, but if you have any of these taxable activities, then it may be reported, and it may end up being treated as a sale of property and subject to capital gains tax of 30%. Now, before we jump to our next topic, I'd like to get your honest opinion, and don't worry if you're yes, no, or the last option. Do you think you've ever filed an incorrect tax return, or maybe misfiled a return, or forgotten to file? Maybe that's yes, no, or I didn't misfile, but I forgot to file for previous years. Again, the next slide will cover what to do in this situation, but it'd be good to get a feel for the audience in terms of whether you think you might be in any of these positions. I'll let that run for a couple more seconds before sharing the results. Great, we're over the 60% mark, so thanks for putting in your votes there. Alrighty, so 6% thinking yes, they have filed an incorrect return before, 69% saying no, and another 25% interestingly saying that they think they've forgotten to file for previous years. If you're in that position, if you've missed a year, or if you filed as a resident by mistake, I would say don't panic, breathe, but do set the record straight. If you've forgotten to file for previous years, you can always catch up. You can backfile at any stage. On Sprintax returns, you can backfile directly for the last 3 years on the software. And if you're due a refund and it's within the last 3 years, the IRS are actually happy to issue a refund back to you. Now, after that 3-year period, unfortunately, you won't be able to get a refund back. And funnily enough, if you owe the IRS taxes, there's no 3-year rule. They'll chase you all the way since you've been in diapers to get their money back. It's not exactly a level playing field, but good for you to know. If you've misfiled, maybe you used TurboTax by mistake or other resident softwares, you can prepare what's called a 1040X. This is an amended US tax return. Sprintax does also have an amended tax return facility. So if you did need help correcting a previous incorrect return, we can also generate this 1040X form for you, or you can download it directly from the IRS website. And I'm sure many of you have implications of not filing. And I want to share with you a story that I heard from a participant last week that had shared this with another colleague of mine. They were a J visa holder. They were in the US on a prior J visa during the time when the COVID stimulus checks were being sent out. And they were going for a second J visa, and the embassy officer actually asked them about their tax compliance and whether or not they had received these stimulus checks that had sometimes gone out incorrectly to non-residents because they had filed incorrectly as a resident for tax purposes. So that was really interesting to hear that story. And what I would say there is you just don't know when your tax compliance could catch up on you, particularly if you're looking for long-term future immigration statuses like H-1B or green card holders. At the end of the day, when you look at the laws set out within your visa, it says you need to oblige by all US laws. That includes your IRS and filing obligations, even if that's just Form 8843. So it's part of maintaining immigration status in the US. Not filing can affect future status. Additionally, if you owe taxes, fines, penalties, and interest can add up there. So we certainly don't want that to happen. And last but not least, you might have worked hard. You might be due a refund. The only way to get a refund back is essentially by filing a tax return here. I would also say be very, very careful about options being recommended to you. Again, I once was an international student. I lived with 2 great American roommates. I would ask them about everyday living in the US for every single topic under the sun. But if you're in that similar position and you're asking them for help with taxes, remember, as a non-resident for tax purposes, different rules apply to you than your fellow American roommates or residents for tax purposes, and you'll need to file different tax forms to them as well. As a result, you'll likely need to use different software. TurboTax is the big one we always hear about. So many international students make the mistake of using TurboTax by mistake. So I've highlighted a screenshot from TurboTax themselves where they say they don't support the 1040NR, the non-resident tax return. They are the resident partner of Sprintax, and we are their non-resident partner. So, we love what they do. They love what we do, but Sprintax only supports non-residents for tax. TurboTax only supports residents for tax purposes. It's really important to be aware and be careful what people are recommending to you. Follow the information coming out from University of Pennsylvania International Office and Tax Team. They are putting in place Sprintax to help you with your filing if you are a non-resident. So that's really, really important to know. Now, for any of you that were working or received taxable and reportable income from University of Pennsylvania, you might be wondering, where can I get my income documents? So this is going to be your how-to on getting those income documents. First is your W-2. If any of you were working, received wages and employment income, that is now available in your Workday account, and or it will be mailed by January 31st this year. So it's already released, it's already live. If you were working during the year, your W-2 is available in Workday. If you were working for other employers outside of UPenn, you'd need to follow up with those employers specifically to get a copy of your W-2. The 1042S, these are also live from UPenn, so they are located in your tax forms section on your Sprintax calculus account. It's under the 2023 tax year, or they also will be mailed by March 15th for anyone who hasn't given e-consent. So these forms are live. Again, you might only receive a 1042S if you had tax treaty exempt income, or you had taxable scholarships or prizes or awards. Not everyone will receive this income document naturally, but if you have, it would be available in your Sprintax calculus account under 2023. If you've not received your forms by March 15th, I've outlined the link that you can follow to get more instructions. And if you did receive a 1042S from Penn, you may be able to transfer that 1042S data from Calculus to Sprintax Returns, which is the tax filing software. And to do that, you'd need to use the same email as is registered on your Calculus account when you're setting up your account on Sprintax Returns, and it will transfer that over, or you can use a transfer option on the tax forms page of Sprintax Calculus itself. Any questions on your W-2 or 1042S? that can go to Penn Employee Solutions Center. The number is there, the email is there, and then questions around 1098Ts are outlined in the link here as well. Some of you might certainly be asking this, what's the difference between Sprintax returns and Sprintax calculus? You might have received invitations to both over the last couple of months. And I'm going to try and break this down very simply. Sprintax calculus and Sprintax returns are two separate softwares. Sprintax calculus is utilized by UPenn, and it's helped to understand your tax position. It's helped to calculate tax withholding on wages or income that you're receiving from the university. And importantly, it helps to generate important tax forms like the 1042S where they are applicable. So it's helping the tax office to understand your tax position and also generate the 1042S at year end. Sprintax returns is the system that helps to prepare your end of year federal and or state tax returns. So your 1040NR, your 8843 and any state tax filing returns. But if you did receive a 1042S, you'll need that information to outline on the Sprintax returns software. So they do speak to each other. What's important here is if you're logging into Sprintax returns or setting up an account and you've received a 1042S from Penn, if you use the same email that's outlined on your calculus account, Sprintax returns will be clever enough to understand you have an account, and it will ask you, do you want to transfer the 1042S data across to your tax filing system? Or there is also a transfer option directly on your tax forms page. What I'd say there is, it's really still important that you access your access code that's contained within global.upenn.edu. I'll share a little bit more on that very shortly about accessing your code. But I just want to say in a nutshell, calculus is there to understand your tax position. Returns is there to help prepare your end of year tax return. So using Sprintax returns to now file your end of year return, you'll have likely received instructions from the international office over the last couple of days via email, which includes your link to Sprintax returns and how to access your unique code to remove the full costs of your federal and 8843 costs on Sprintax. Firstly, you can create a Sprintax account, or you can log into your Sprintax returns account. What I'd say there again is if you receive a 1042S form, you can use the same email as is present in your calculus account to transfer that 1042S form over to returns, or you can use the transfer option in calculus. You'll then complete the Sprintax online questionnaire. We'll understand your tax position. We'll ask you to upload any income documents you received. So if you had a W-2 or 1099s or 1042Ss, you can outline that information on the return software. And then you'll need to enter your unique access code. To get that unique code, you'll need to log into ITIN with your Penn key and password. Once you're logged into ITIN, you'll click Taxes on the left menu and select the subheader Sprintax System. That will help you to obtain your unique code for outlining that at the checkout. So there is a Sprintax UPenn specific link for accessing Sprintax returns. I've outlined that here. Once you follow that, you can create your account or you can log in. You'll select what tax year you need support with. This filing season is 2023. And then we will confirm your tax residency. So you will be asked to confirm your visits in and out of the US, the immigration status that you were on, and we'll use that information to confirm whether or not you are a resident or non-resident for tax purposes for this year. If you're a resident, we'll stop you on this page. We'll outline that you'll need to double check your information, but if you are a resident, you can then actually file as a resident using softwares like TurboTax, for example. But if you're a non-resident for tax, which many of you will be, we'll continue to bring you through the software. We'll ask you if you've earned any US source income. If you haven't earned US income, we'll quickly bring you through the software to prepare an 8843. But if you have received US income, we'll outline what income documents did you receive and how many of each have you received. So if you got a W-2, for example, you can outline that information on the system. You can actually upload a digital copy of your W-2 or other income documents directly onto Sprintax returns using our OCR feature. What I'd say there is, you only need to upload one copy of your digital income document. You'll notice that a W-2 has multiple copies. Same with 1042Ss. You only need to include one copy of that income document when you're uploading it to Sprintax. For W-2 state tax queries, this can come up sometimes. For teaching fellows or research fellows, you're subject to federal income tax, City of Philadelphia wage tax, but not Pennsylvania personal income tax. So blank state wages and state income tax information may indicate other exempt income when you're outlining this on the Sprintax returns software. System will also then look at the source of your income, your time spent in the state, and it will help to confirm whether or not you might have triggered a state tax filing obligation, not only for Pennsylvania, but for any other states that you might have earned income in, or you might have resided in for any part of the tax year. You'll then arrive at the order breakdown. This is where you can insert that access code to remove the full cost of your federal return and 8843. So the international office have created a great incentive for you to file your federal tax return for free here. So do make sure you follow the steps outlined in yellow here. You log into IPEN with your Penn key and password. You click on taxes, Sprintax system, you get your code, and you can enter that at checkout here. If you have any additional, if you want to use Sprintax for state returns, there is an additional charge there of $44.95 per state return. And there are other optional add-ons if you'd like to use those. You will see that there's an option to remove them if you don't want to use Sprintax for those services. So they're always optional for you to include. Once you've passed the checkout stage, if you're eligible to e-file, we'll give you the option to e-file your federal tax return. And you'll see a screen that looks like this with proceed with e-filing. E-filing option is here for eligible individuals. There is eligibility criteria around e-filing. So we do have a blog that explains more around your eligibility criteria. So you can follow that there. If you aren't eligible for e-filing, you'll need to print, sign, and mail your federal return to the IRS. If you have a state tax return or just need to file Form 8843 alone, you also need to print, sign, and mail those. And we give a full instructions pack that you can download. You'll see the address that you need to send it to. You'll need to sign the 1040-NR or the state return, include copies of your income documents, and then mail those to the tax authorities if you're not able to e-file them. Now, in terms of other support outside of things like today's webinar, what I failed to mention there is that there is live chat directly in the Sprintax return software. So if you have questions when you're going through the questionnaire, you can rely on our live chat team. There is also our email support for returns, which is hello@sprintax.com. We've got lots of educational tax videos on our YouTube channel. We've got blog content for tax awareness. We've covered lots of different topics of taxes for international students and scholars. And then we also have lots of open tax workshops and webinars for you to be aware of. And then Sprintax forums. This is only applicable to anyone who's going on off-campus OPT in the months ahead. If you're about to start OPT and you're going to work with an employer outside of the university, we've often found that those employers don't really have much of an understanding of taxing non-residents. So we have outlined an open version of Sprintax Calculus where you can create an account, outline that employer's details, and understand your FICA taxes eligibility, your tax residency, and it will generate your W-4 form to make sure you're taxed correctly with your new employer. So I hope that you found this session to at least put your mind a little bit more at ease about what you need to do from a tax perspective. I know there's a lot that we covered there, which is the reason why we usually always have a recording, and you'll have the slides attached as well to reference back to. But I will have a look now in the questions tab to see, are there any common themes that have been popping up, and see if there is anything I can help to demystify, as I say. So great, thanks so much for all the votes there. Great to see the results back there in terms of finding it helpful. let's see if there's anything that we can help answer. What if a spouse is here as a visitor? So if your spouse isn't on a, let's say, a J2 or an F2, they won't need to file a Form 8843. If they only arrived, on a tourist visa to see you for a week, that's a different story. But if you're F, J, M, or Q visa holders, those exempt individuals would need to prepare Form 8843 if they were present under that status during 23. Does a minor qualify to be a non-resident? How can I file for a 12-year-old? So yeah, if they're present with you on, let's say, a J2 or F2, they may also need to file Form 8843. You can add a dependent Form 8843 when you're going through the Sprintax return software. So you can key in details for your son or daughter there, and you can help to submit that to the IRS. We are MBA students and start working after 2 years. Are we still non-residents for the next 3 years? If we get H1B visa, do we lose our non-resident status? So, depending on your visa status, F1 or J1 student visa will be 5 years of non-resident status. Scholars, researchers, professors, interns will be given 2 years. After that period of time, you then count your days towards a substantial presence test. If you pass that test, you're then deemed a resident. For H1B visa holders, they would generally become residents for tax purposes after 183 days. They're no longer deemed an exempt individual, so their days start counting towards that test right off the bat. Best thing there is to use the Sprintax residency tool to be able to confirm your tax residency with certainty. I filed last year, I never got my return. What should I do? I would check the where's my refund status. That is the best thing to see. Do the IRS even have a copy of your return that they're processing? If they don't, you might need to either contact the IRS or they may not have received it. So you may need to file that return again if it's the case that they don't actually have a copy of it. I have seen the IRS losing returns from time to time. I received a scholarship from a university in 2023. I got a 1099 MISC. They did not withhold taxes in advance. I stayed in the US less than 183 days. Right now, when I try to fill in the forms in Sprintax, it asked me to pay taxes in arrears. How did it not show my tax treaty? What should I do? Well, if you had a taxable scholarship or a treaty benefit, you likely would have received a 1042S form. So it's interesting that you got a 1099 there from the university. What I'd say there is, some folks do get 1099s. There's no taxes withheld on it, and you end up paying taxes that are due on that income when you're filing your return. So it can always be a bit of a sting for non-residents, and it can be the case that you may owe taxes. In terms of treaty eligibility, I wouldn't know enough details to say that off the bat, but you can reach out to our live chat or our email support, hello@sprintax.com, if you wanted to have a closer look at that and your treaty eligibility. But it is common for someone to get 1099s and have to pay taxes on that income because taxes weren't withheld at source for that. Is there a way I can reach out to Sprintax team to support me with my taxes? My case is a bit complicated. I have a minor, I have 4 W2s and never received my return last year. So we don't have, let's say, in-person offices to help one case by case. Our email support and live chat team are there to help. If you have 4 W2s, don't worry, you can actually add multiple W2s on the Sprintax return software. And then in regards to your minor, you can add, you'll see the option to add a dependent Form 8843. Unfortunately, it's very unlikely that you might be able to claim child tax credits or dependents on your return, as very few non-residents can do so. The exception being Canada, South Korea, India, or Mexico that have qualifying children, which need to basically be a US citizen, have a tax number on file. So it's likely you might just need to file a Form 8843 there for the minor, and you can report your 4 W2s on the Sprintax return software. I didn't receive income during 2023, but I just started OPT and received income. Will I still need to file Form 8843? If you didn't receive any US income in 2023, you'll just need to file Form 8843 most likely for that year. If you started earning income in 2024, then it's likely you'll need to file a tax return this time next year when you're filing your 24 return. How do we apply the US-China tax treaty on our tax return? When you're going through the Sprintax software, if you are eligible to utilize a treaty benefit, Sprintax returns will show that option. Some things to make sure of: just double check that your immigration status is correct on Sprintax returns. You know, an F1 student versus a different immigration status, if you entered it incorrectly, can disqualify a treaty benefit. So make sure your immigration status is correct when you're on Sprintax returns. Double check your income information is correct, your W-2s, your 1042Ss, and if you are eligible to claim a treaty benefit, Sprintax returns will provide that option. I was an independent contractor for another company. They didn't withhold tax. Do I need to pay tax on that? It's very likely you will. So you will be able to report that. You probably got a 1099. You'll be able to outline that income document on Sprintax returns, and you may have to pay taxes on that income. The deadline for filing is 15th of April. Does that mean it has to be received by 15th of April or sent? As long as your return is postmarked April 15th, you will be, you'll be within that deadline. What I understand is if I receive any type of income while I was on my J1 and I haven't received a W-2 form and 1042S form, does that mean I only need to file Form 8843? So if you didn't receive any US income, you're correct. You just need to file Form 8843 if you were present during 2023. What if your country has a tax treaty with the US? Treaties are built into the Sprintax return software, so we will be able to recognize if there is a treaty benefit, and you'll be able to apply it on your tax return. If we only received income from student loans and fellowships, should we try to deduct interest payments, expenses of the student loans? So if you had interest on a qualifying student loan, you would get a 1098E. That will outline the interest. You can actually deduct that on your tax return. And there is a section on Sprintax where you can offset qualified student loan interest or also charitable contributions. If you receive taxable scholarships or fellowships, that might be reported on a 1042S. So I'm not too sure if you might also have some reportable income there. I was only in the US for 17 days last year. Do I have to fill Form 8843? If you are an F or J visa holder, which you likely were, you will need to file Form 8843 as a non-resident there for 2023. If I'm holding an F1 visa, do I need to file W4 form when school always withhold 14% on my stipend? It sounds like you might be getting scholarship or stipend there. They might, 14% is a quite a common rate of withholding to be applied on scholarship. W4 wouldn't be needed there if you're just getting stipends. Usually just a W8 Ben form, which confirms your foreign status. And if you were treaty benefit, if you were treaty eligible, a W8 Ben would also outline the treaty benefit there. But 14% is common withholding on a stipend or scholarship. How do we mail physical forms to the IRS? Can we use regular mail? You can, yes. What I would recommend is if you can use tracked mail, that will help to confirm whether your tax return arrived at the IRS's door. So I would always recommend, if you can have any tracking option on your mail, to do that to make sure you know that it's arrived. I think I wrongly gave my independent contractor a W9 at the start. Should I now give them a W8 Ben instead? You'd have to. I can't really advise there in terms of you need to double check your tax residency there. If you're working with an employer, if you were going to be set up on payroll, they'd usually need a W4 form. W8 Ben would confirm your foreign status as well if you are a non-resident for tax purposes. But residents for tax purposes would complete a W9 in some cases. What if we received a foreign honorarium? So a scholarship paid from a non-USA source. So if it's a foreign scholarship outside of the US, you can, it's deemed as foreign source income. So if your home country university or a provider in your home country provided you with a scholarship to study in the US, that's generally going to be non-taxable, non-reportable. What do you mean when you said to attach only one copy of the W-2? The W-2 has a copy C, B, and additional copies. So yeah, the W-2 has different copies because if you're filing a federal return, it might need one copy to be sent with your physical return to the IRS. You might need another copy for your state return. You might need one copy for your own references. So that's what happens when, when you're uploading your W-2, you'll need to include information from one of those copies on the electronic OCR feature. If we claim tax treaties for years but then become a resident or get a different visa, do we have to pay back all those exemptions? Not necessarily. It really depends. There are some treaties that have clawbacks, sometimes on the researcher side or teacher side. But it will depend on your own immigration status and your own circumstances. Many of those treaties, for example, taxable scholarship, you'll be able to utilize without having any particular clawbacks, but it will depend on your own individual circumstances there. Great, we're just on the hour. I think I've covered most of those questions. What I'd say is thanks for all of your attentiveness and all of your questions that have come through there. I hope that's really helped. We will have a copy of the recording that's going to be made available to all of you. You'll get a copy in the next 24 hours, and we'll also share that with the university. So thanks everyone for joining today's session. Again, I wish you all the very best of luck with your tax filing obligations, and don't leave it until April 15th. If you're ready to file now, go ahead and start the process. You'll save yourself a lot of time and stress by not leaving it until the very last moment. So once again, thanks so much everyone, and the very best of luck with your filing season obligations.